In this video, we're going to talk about workflow versioning. With workflow versioning, you can test and develop different versions of a workflow without breaking the one you have in production. Let's look at an example. In Losant, you can build some pretty complex workflows. In this particular workflow, we're tracking the position of the terminal train at the CVG airport. As you can guess, making a slight change to this workflow could have some unintended side effects. We can use versioning to copy this workflow and test it without affecting what's currently deployed. Let's try that out now. Notice, next to the name of the workflow, there are two labels, Develop and Default. Develop is a special workflow version. It is the only workflow that we are allowed to edit. Default means that this workflow version is currently in production. It is the version that runs when a payload triggers the workflow without a specific version specified. Normally, devices don't specify a workflow version, which means they'll just trigger whatever version was marked as default. This allows us to mark different versions as default to change what's in production without having to modify any firmware on the devices. When the devices in the CVG terminal send data, they're not specifying a version, so they'll trigger the default version of this workflow, which is currently develop. CVG has two concourses, A and B. Let's pretend they're planning to add a new concourse C. This workflow needs to be updated to reflect this change. We'll also need to test this new functionality before we mark the workflow as default and push it to production. Since develop is the only version we are allowed to edit, and it's currently marked as default, any deployed changes will immediately go into production. If we make bad changes, this will break our production app. So, before we start making changes, we need to version this workflow. We can create a new version of this workflow, call it 1.0, and make it the default version. Once you click Create Version, this version will be set to default and all of our devices will now trigger the 1.0 version of this workflow. That allows me to continue to develop on the developed version without breaking production. As you can see, this workflow is read-only. This is to make sure that there are never unintended changes to a version. Now, we can safely go back to develop and make changes to the workflow. Since our developed version is no longer default, nothing will automatically trigger this workflow version. Now, many of our triggers allow you to specify a workflow version to trigger. When using a device trigger, this gives us the ability to set up a test device to trigger our developed workflow. For example, our test device can report state and specify a flow version of the workflow to trigger. In this case, we're triggering the developed workflow, but you could trigger any other version. Now that we know how to test our developed workflow, we can go back and deploy. Now let's say we tested everything and all looks good. Well, we can create a new version of this workflow and name it 2.0, mark it as default, and push these changes to production. Now as you can see, 2.0 is marked as default. Let's recap. With versioning, we were able to develop, create version 1 of our workflow, make changes to our workflow, release a second version, all without impacting our production environment. Now that you know a little bit about workflow versionings, be sure to check out our docs for more information, or if you have any questions, please post them to the forums. Thank you.